So as far as the Russian hacks go, I know normally you can't discuss, sources and methods and how you guys are getting intelligence, but can you at least characterize the sort of intelligence that's coming in that proves that this was a Russian hack? Is it digital fingerprints that you're tracing back to a computer in Russian possession? Is it human sourcing that you're intercepting phone calls and hearing Russians talk about this kind of thing?
Yeah.
Where's the confidence coming from?
Well, I'm obviously quite limited in what I can say from here, but I think there are a couple of things that I can point to that I think
Look at your notes. Look at your notes.
that I think answer the questions that you've raised. It's essentially two. The first is the statement that was issued by the intelligence community in October of 2016, before the election, making clear that Russia was interfering in our election, represented the consensus view of 17 different intelligence agencies.
How dare you question them?
That's not usually the way intelligence works. That kind of unanimity of opinion, particularly when the stakes are so high, is notable.
The intelligence was wrong. We would not have gone into Iraq. But the intelligence community, all 16 agencies, assured us that it was right. My speech at the UN was based on that information.
Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
Russian hackers penetrated U.S. electricity grid through a utility in Vermont, U.S. officials say. That was the headline from the Washington Post on Friday. By now, you might have heard that these Russian hackers attempted to access the power grid in Vermont. The only problem with the story? It's not true. But this fake news story was published by the Post. And yet, among most media and social sites like Facebook, there is no outrage over this fake news. So what happened? Let's give it a reality check. So I've got about 3 minutes to explain, so let me give you the rundown. It was Friday night, 7:55 p.m. when the Washington Post ran its first article, claiming that Russian hackers connected to a high-level Russian government operation known as Grizzly Steep had penetrated the Vermont utility. The Post did not have even one single named source for this information and instead was relying on an anonymous source from Homeland Security. And yet that same evening, between 9:24 and 10:06 p.m., the Post updated the article to state that multiple computer systems at the utility had been breached. Quote, officials said that it was unclear when the code entered the Vermont utility's computers and that an investigation will attempt to determine the timing and the nature, it says, of the intrusion. Well, the article began to spread on social media and it grew from 8 to 18 paragraphs. But as it grew, it did not include one single statement from the utility in question, which is why within an hour and a half of that first article being published, the utility company itself came forward, releasing this statement, which actually corrected the Post's article. They said, quote, we detected the malware in a single Burlington Electric Department laptop not connected to our organization's grid systems. We took immediate action to isolate the laptop and alerted federal officials of this finding. Okay, so did you get that? It was not the power grid. It was a single laptop not connected to the grid. But that laptop was still accessed by Russian hackers, right? Well, no, maybe not, and here's why. Burlington Electric said in a statement that the company, well, it detected a malware code used in the Grizzly Steep operation, but the malware in question is actually available for purchase online. That means anyone could have used it, or what is most likely here is that an employee using that laptop had accessed the website infected with malware. 5 days after blowing this story, the Post finally admitted it got it wrong, saying this. The Post initially reported incorrectly that the country's electric grid had been penetrated through a Vermont utility. After Burlington Electric released a statement saying that the potentially compromised laptop had not been connected to the grid, the Post immediately corrected its article and later added an editor's note explaining the change. Yeah, but that's really not true. See, the paper kept changing and amending the story with no editor's notes explaining what was being changed. And Forbes explains it like this. The following morning, nearly 11 hours after changing the headline and rewriting the article to indicate that the grid itself was never breached and that the hack was only an isolated laptop with malware, the Post still had not appended any kind of editorial note to indicate that it had significantly changed the focus of the article. So what you need to know is that Glenn Greenwald makes a great point when he says that journalists, especially in cases like this, must not simply accept what governments state as absolute truth. Remember, it was a DHS source who initially leaked the story. What likely happened here, someone from DHS tipped off the Post reporter about Russians hacking the U.S. power grid, and the paper decided to simply believe that source rather than take the basic journalistic step of checking the facts.
26-year-old Esteban Santiago shot and killed 5 people, wounded 8 others at the Fort Lauderdale airport. He had an active U.S. military ID. He opened fire at a baggage carousel there at Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport. And a lot of people were sort of seen today on the television scrambling there on the tarmac. What we know about this man thus far is that apparently he collected his luggage from the carousel and then loaded the weapon in the bathroom and then went out and were shooting people execution style. Well, now there's kind of some conflicting stories coming out. Air Canada says that they have no record of this Florida suspect on any of their flights. As well, they say they have no record of any checked guns on any of the flights to Fort Lauderdale. So they're saying that he came in from a flight from Canada. So there's just a little bit of a discrepancy there. And then also, once again, we have someone who was known to the authorities. Apparently, in November of 2016, he went to the FBI headquarters in Anchorage, Alaska, and said that he was being forced to fight for ISIS. At the time, they sent him to a hospital there for a psychological examination. They sent him to the psych hospital. So here he is still in possession of his weapons. He's carrying them on a plane with him. He also had apparently been investigated by Homeland Security investigators for child porn. They, at the time, seized 3 weapons and a computer, but there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute him at the time. Now, the suspect was not hurt in this incident. He just laid on the ground and was ready to be taken away after he ran out of ammunition. This story is still developing, so we will have all the updates throughout the weekend on any new information that comes in. But, you know, we just had a flashback from the Brussels attack last year where they were talking about the fact that now it was time to start moving these security checkpoints and these scanners outside of the airport. So indeed here, now that this happened at the baggage claim at the carousel, this is going to, of course, affect the way that people are allowed to bring guns on flights with them as well. They're going to be moving these security checkpoints outside of the airport. Absolutely. And the authorities cannot conclude at this time if there is a much more sinister motive behind this attack. Was he indeed being directed by ISIS? Was he having psychiatric problems, thinking that he was being controlled by ISIS? We do not know at this time. We can't say for sure if it was an act of terrorism or if this is just another lone wolf.
Gas prices spike in Mexico. Chaos ensues. Protesters have taken to the streets, highways are blocked, traffic is snarled. Some are even looting gas stations and stores. On Thursday, January 5th, a trade group reported more than 300 stores looted and 170 more closed as a result of roadblocks. The unrest is due to gasoline deregulation efforts that President Enrique Peña Nieto calls necessary for the nation's economic stability. The move has sent gas prices soaring by up to 20%. 1 gallon now costs about as much as a day's work for Mexico's minimum wage. Peña Nieto says, quote, "I understand the anger and irritation felt by the general public."
There were 4 previous deaths in incidents over the past few days. Officials say some 300 stores have been looted and more than 1,000 people have been detained over the violence. Mexicans have been left outraged after authorities raised fuel prices on January 1st. The government says the rise is a necessary measure as part of a deregulation strategy of the energy sector.
Following a 20% petrol price hike by state oil company Pemex, violence erupted across Mexico as public anger turned into riots and looting. Protesters barricaded roads and looted shops in various parts of Mexico. Blockades of fuel storage terminals by protesters brought Pemex operations to a standstill. Extra police patrols were deployed and hundreds of people were arrested during the unrest. The price hike sees Mexicans paying almost $1 for a litre of premium fuel, nearly as much as the minimum daily wage in the country.
If petrol prices go up, then every other price goes up because things need to be transported in order for business to be done. Pemex was founded to fairly share out the country's resources, but Mexicans have seen no benefit.
Mexico will open its petrol industry to the private sector in April, and President Peña Nieto stated on Wednesday that the price hike was essential for Pemex to remain competitive. Yet December 2016 saw Pemex close the year with a debt of $97 billion, leading many Mexicans to blame institutional corruption rather than economic foresight for the higher rates at the pump.
Pemex is having trouble due to government corruption. One way to stop these protests would be for the government to punish the corporate chiefs responsible for this, but this is very unlikely to happen.
The Mexican government is desperately looking for ways to ease public anger over the petrol price hike, which has turned into violence across the country. With nightly riots and looting showing no signs of abating, the year 2017, President Peña Nieto's last full year in office, is shaping up to be a very difficult one.
It's not exactly the most encouraging news to kick off 2017. A University of Connecticut professor says a society could collapse in the 2020s due to increasing social unrest. Peter Turchin is an evolutionary anthropologist whose latest book is called Ages of Discord, a structural demographic analysis of American history. He's a leader in the field of cliodynamics, which analyzes historical events like a science using predictions and models. And using a model that tracks a number of factors, he predicts that social instability and political violence will peak in the 2020s. One of those factors is elite overproduction, where society's elite population grows larger and more distant than the poor.
Now, the United Nations Children's Fund has warned that children in the Syrian capital Damascus are at risk now of waterborne diseases. UNICEF said the children are bearing the brunt of the sabotage of the city's main water supplies. Damascus, which is home to nearly 6 million people, has been deprived of running water for 2 weeks now. In a letter to the UN, the Syrian Foreign Ministry has accused al-Nusra Front terrorists of destroying the main water supply and polluting it, I should add, with diesel fuel. UN has confirmed the deliberate targeting of the water resources in Damascus, but then has not stated who's responsible. On Thursday, the humanitarian advisor to the UN Syria envoy, John Egeland, said that denying people water or deliberately sabotaging water supplies is in fact a war crime.
The South Korean government has announced new measures to punish farmers who do not report suspected cases of avian influenza. Under the new guidelines announced by the Agriculture Ministry on this Saturday, farmers could face up to 3 years behind bars or a fine of up to 30 million won, that's roughly $25,000. They would also see their compensation cut by up to 40%. The ministry says a lack of prompt reporting by some farms was a key factor in the rapid spread of the latest bird flu outbreak, the worst now in the nation's history. Millions of chickens and other poultry birds have been culled as a precaution against the spread. The outbreak has caused egg prices to spike. Local retail giant Emart says the price of a carton of 30 eggs has shot up 30% since the turn of the year to around 8,000 won, about $6.50.
Zimbabwean authorities are working hard to contain a typhoid outbreak in the country. Over 2,225 suspected cases of the bacterial infection have now been reported nationwide. An interministerial intervention has been launched by the government to spearhead efforts to contain the outbreak. Thuli Shabalala has more.
Zimbabwe is scrambling to contain an outbreak of typhoid. Citizens blame water shortages and poor hygiene for the spread of the bacterial infection. The potentially deadly fever has so far claimed 9 lives, but there are over 2,000 suspected cases countrywide. Authorities have set up a ministerial committee to combat the waterborne disease.
With only two weeks remaining until President-elect Donald Trump takes the presidential oath, China has already been testing his temperament. Recent air and sea drills of new advanced military weaponry suggest Beijing won't back away from projecting its power in East Asia. Meng Fai Li has the story.
While Americans enjoyed New Year's football games, China successfully completed live-fire exercises of its first advanced fighter jets. Called the J-15 Liaoning, the Chinese Navy tested the jets in the South China Sea on the country's first aircraft carrier. The flights indicate the Chinese government is now fully equipped with advanced weaponry to reach well beyond its own territory. Also, it sent a message to the incoming Trump administration that China will not back down from claiming ownership of the South China Sea. One Chinese naval officer said the new jets performed well during difficult conditions.
We have accumulated experience and got familiar with the way of how to operate the carrier under complicated conditions.
Last year, tensions with the United States escalated when the Chinese Navy seized a U.S. underwater drone near the Philippines. President-elect Trump said China could keep the drone, but Beijing eventually returned it. Meanwhile, U.S. ally Taiwan is nervous about China's military buildup and says it could threaten the balance of power in the East Asia region. President-elect Trump has already expressed concerns about China's military expansion in the South China Sea. He has yet to announce specifics on how he may respond to Beijing's buildup.
Well, that was quick. Part of London has already passed its annual limits for pollution, and it only took 5 days. Law states hourly levels of nitrogen dioxide can't exceed a certain measurement more than 18 times a year. But by January 5th, readings on a road in the city had passed those limits, and at one point, levels of the gas were almost 1.5 times the legal amount. This isn't too shocking. Last year, London passed annual limits in just a week. Nitrogen dioxide pollution in the city is produced largely by diesel vehicles. In 2010, a study estimated up to 5,900 deaths in London could be linked to long-term exposure to the gas.
If you're pretty confident that you'd survive a zombie apocalypse, prepare to hear some bad news. A new report suggests a real-life zombie takeover would put an end to the human race quicker than a season of The Walking Dead. Students at the UK's University of Leicester used a basic model to calculate how fast a contagious disease spreads through a population. Assuming every zombie infects one person a day, the zombie virus would spread twice as fast as the Black Death. This would annihilate the human race in just 100 days, leaving a very small group of survivors. Our odds look pretty bleak, but the students say in a second study that if humans were prepared for a zombie apocalypse, survivors could fight back and, in theory, be able to outlast the undead and repopulate the Earth.
The statement that was issued by the intelligence community in October of 2016, before the election, making clear that Russia was interfering in our election, represented the consensus view of 17 different intelligence agencies.
How dare you question them?
That's not usually the way intelligence works. That kind of unanimity of opinion, particularly when the stakes are so high, is notable.
They attempted to access the power grid in Vermont. The only problem with the story, it's not true. But this fake news story was published by The Post. And yet among most media and social sites like Facebook, there is no outrage over this fake news. So what happened? Let's give it a reality check. So I've got about 3 minutes to explain, so let me give you the rundown. It was Friday night, 7:55 p.m. when the Washington Post ran its first article claiming that Russian hackers connected to a high-level Russian government operation known as Grizzly Steep.
So as far as the Russian hacks go, I know normally you can't discuss, sources and methods and how you guys are getting intelligence, but can you at least characterize the sort of intelligence that's coming in that proves that this was a Russian hack? Is it digital fingerprints that you're tracing back to a computer in Russian possession? Is it human sourcing that you're intercepting phone calls and hearing Russians talk about this kind of thing?
Yeah.
Where's the confidence coming from?
Well, I'm obviously quite limited in what I can say from here, but I think there are a couple of things that I can point to that I think
Look at your notes. Look at your notes.
that I think answer the questions that you've raised. It's essentially two. The first is
intelligence was wrong. Yeah. We would not have gone into Iraq. But the intelligence community, all 16 agencies, assured us that it was right. My speech at the UN was based on that information. Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
Russian hackers penetrated U.S. electricity grid through a utility in Vermont, U.S. officials say. That was the headline from the Washington Post on Friday. By now, you might have heard that these Russian hackers